Hi, everyone. I'm Dino Altamari, Director of Education here at Banffy Wines, and I am absolutely thrilled to be joined today by our winemaker at Pacific Rim, Tim Henley. Tim, I can't thank you enough for being here.
My pleasure, Dino. I'm excited about the wine we're going to talk about today, and it's great to meet with you.
As am I. Thank you. I'm really, really excited to chat about our latest release, which I know we've all been eagerly awaiting, from Horse Heaven Hills in Washington State, of course, our new Silver Raven Cabernet Sauvignon. And I gotta say, just kind of holding this bottle in person for the first time, the label just pops. So, since I think presence and package are really the first things that people are going to see, I'd love to start there if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's begin. We're going to call this our 10 questions with Tim.
All right,
So
fantastic.
it really is honestly such a standout label. It's bold, it's really playful. I think that's the case with all of our wines, honestly, from Pacific Rim, and really distinctive and elegant. And I think it really ties us to our origins here in the Pac Northwest. As we know, the Raven really represents the complexity, the beauty of nature, which of course abounds in the Pac Northwest. And I think you really see that come through in the colors on the label. So I guess I wonder if you can tell us, Tim, kind of what drew you here as a winemaker, and what's exciting for you about our wines in our region right now.
So I was, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but I was born and raised in California, started my career as a winemaker down in California. And after working there, 10 years roughly, let's call it 10 years,
Sure.
to go with 10 questions with Tim. But 5 years on what's called the Central Coast area of California, so in the Santa Maria Valley area, and then 5 years in the Napa Valley. I mean, California is great. Fantastic winemakers, all which contributed to my experience and my education. But when I was given the opportunity to move up to Washington, it was like a fresh start. It was like a brand new beginning. It was coming up to uncharted territory. Um, and now that I say that with you, it almost sounds absurd because I know one of the first things that struck me when I came to Washington State was the quality of wines that are coming out of Washington and how California centric my view was.
Yeah, and we're gonna get to that. I think it's a really important part of this conversation around Silver Raven. Um, and I think kind of one of the things right off the top, we know that Washington, of course, dictates a 75% rule, right, as a minimum for varietal labeling. So in order to call our wine Cabernet Sauvignon, you've got to have at least 75% Cab. We, of course, with Silver Raven, doing considerably more, about 95% Cabernet Sauvignon. And I'm actually really interested to hear just real quickly about that 5% Malbec because it's a really unique choice and it's one that we see in some of our other red wines, Thick Skin, for example, which you, of course, also make.
Right.
And it really sets that wine apart. So just tell me a little bit about why that choice for a little bit of an addition of Malbec.
Why Malbec and Silver Raven and Thick Skin, I'm going to compare and contrast a little here. So they both bring something to the blend, right? Most
Mhm.
people, when they hear blends, they think of wines called red blends, where this is a Cabernet, this is a varietal wine. But because of that percentage, we have the ability to blend in other things. And
Mhm.
in this case, it's to bring complexity. And same with thick skin. The Malbec from the Horse Heaven Hills displays a different character than Malbec from Red Mountain. But they both bring spice, they bring fruit, they elevate the fruit character, they bring plushness.
Mhm.
So they take away from Cabernet by itself is fantastic, makes great wine, but sometimes by blending in, say as simple as 5%, you can make a better wine.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of our follow-up, let's say our next question, right? With that in mind, and really turning to Cabernet, how does now, in that combination, how does Silver Raven deliver, in your mind, a wine drinker's Cabernet, right? How is it different from Cabernet, say, from Napa or Sonoma?
Right. So when I think of wine and what its purpose is, right? One, it's to bring pleasure.
Absolutely.
Um, but you've also got our classic, say, maybe European model where the wines, and you could speak to this better than I can, but it feels to me like European, it's much more about food and wine pairing, Where here in the US, there's a lot more of drinking wine as a standalone beverage.
Sure.
And I think one of the things we do really well here in Washington State, and specifically Pacific Rim with the Silver Raven, is marrying those two concepts together. So making a wine that has plenty of character and the ability to stand out on its own, but there's also a vibrancy and a freshness that allows it to pair with foods.
Yeah. So you're getting a little bit of that kind of old world style elegance, but this freshness, this vibrancy that we have certainly in Washington and Horse Heaven Hills in particular, that you kind of blend together this great old and new world
Absolutely.
capacity. Yeah. So I guess if we drill down into that, because we've mentioned it, from there, what makes Horse Heaven Hills so special, in particular for Cabernet?
Right. So if you look, I mean, behind me here, you can see the poster of the Missoula floods.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the soils of Eastern Washington as a whole, there's a lot of similarities running throughout Eastern Washington. What you do see, though, and why the Horse Heaven Hills is unique is their location, right? In particular, the vineyard we're sourcing from is up on a bluff above the Columbia River.
Hmm.
And because it's almost a direct shot out to the Pacific Ocean, there is a lot of wind influence.
Interesting.
So even during the hottest days of summer,
Hmm.
there is still a nice cooling breeze blowing through that vineyard. And I've seen, people in California talking about, oh, with climate change, maybe we need to start using shade cloths. Maybe we need to put in micro sprinklers. There's
Mm,
techniques to cool the fruit off. Well, with natural Pacific air wind currents, we have our cooling.
right.
So it allows those grapes to ripen properly with lots of nice heat and develop ripe fruit flavors, but maintain this vibrancy from the cooling effect of the wind.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's always been so interesting for me about, certainly Washington in general, but really about this particular area and Horse Heaven Hills, where you're achieving that both fruit and phenolic ripeness kind of at a better pace and more in equilibrium together. And I think you mentioned it there. You're getting the good ripe fruit, but you're maintaining that vibrancy in a very different way. And really special for our particular vineyards, as you mentioned. With that, I guess too, of course, we're talking about our new release, which is vintage 2022 Silver Raven.
Yes,
And I'm wondering if you can just tell us a little bit about that vintage, the conditions that you saw kind of throughout the year and certainly at harvest.
sure. So 2022 started off cooler and rainier, right? So
Okay.
we have a delayed spring, which I also definitely contributes to and when I say delayed, it's in reference to California,
Sure.
right? So
Okay.
where their vines might wake up and start growing as early as February,
Okay.
we're not going to start waking up and growing until March or April, May,
Wow.
some years, right? And with a cool delayed spring, rain, cool weather, there's potential for that to delay harvest. Depending on how quick winter sets, that could actually be very detrimental to the wine quality.
Sure.
Fortunately for us, once spring was done, we had a very nice warm summer, lots of growth. The vines caught back up to our friends in California. And then when it came time for harvest, temperatures cool off into the 70s and 80s, and we had an abundant sunshine. So what this does is give you ample hang time without raisin or pruny flavors developing. But all in all, it was a beautiful vintage.
No, that's great, and that's what we were getting at. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about why now. And I think the vintage certainly had a lot to do with that.
Absolutely.
And of course, from there, if you can give us just kind of a 30,000-foot view, right, about some of the decisions that you had to make from harvest to bottle, right? Take us through the process, the winemaking, to really deliver this beautiful wine to us in this vintage.
Sure. So from the get go, I mean, so we pull from multiple blocks out of the Horse Heaven Hills, meaning one vineyard, but each block is planted to a different clone of Cabernet. Each block is picked separately. So as you go through and make the final cuvee, that all comes into play. Is what are the favorite wines from the vintage? How do they
Sure.
marry together? looking at the Malbec aspect of it, right? Do we use Malbec at all? If so, what's the percent? And behind each one of these decisions, it's rare for someone outside the winery to see this, but these are trial upon trial, meaning, my coworker Scott, he'll set up these trials at our request. And then as a team, myself, Stephen Sealock, and Scott will sit down and taste through these and talk about them.
Sure.
And sometimes we're in a harmonious agreement, and there's other times where we'll narrow it down to two or three choices, and then it's a discussion. But it's definitely a team effort, right? And so that's all from selection of oak
Hmm.
to which wines make the final blend,
Right.
to fining, to adjust the tannin structure of the wine, right? Tannins being the scrapey, more aggressive components that you would find in a red wine versus maybe a white. And when we're trying to create a beverage that brings pleasure, we don't want anything that juts out or causes an unpleasant sensation.
No, of course. And I think that's what's beautiful. We'll talk through tasting through the wine in a moment, but already what's jumping out to me is this elegance, right? And this balance of kind of all these important touch points. And as you go through, I know we're fermenting, of course, in stainless steel. Um, Mallow, I believe, is also happening in stainless steel, if I'm not
Correct.
mistaken. And then what, only about half the wine is actually aged in oak, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So it's trying to, as we talked about earlier, with the best of the old and the new worlds, the best of
Hmm.
Europe with the best of the United States. It's very similar with the winemaking philosophy, right? We're going to get wines in stainless steel that have more of the vibrancy and the fresh fruit, where the oak component, very vital, but is going to bring a very different aging to the wine and is going to bring some more of the toasty notes,
Sure.
things like vanilla that we all love I love it as a winemaker. I love
Right.
a little pop of vanilla.
Right. So in that respect, we are doing both French and American, if I'm not mistaken, right? Which
Correct.
helps to bring certainly that structure, but that depth, as you were saying, kind of retaining that freshness, but giving us some of that really nice richness, some of those nice toasty characters that we're looking for. So I guess with all of that in mind, and certainly including the vintage conditions in 2022, look, I know this wine has been a long time in the making. And so if you can tell us a little about kind of how or why, as I mentioned before, we decided to finally launch this really fresh, exciting take on Washington Cabernet now with this vintage, kind of all of these things coming together.
Sure. So I've been at the winery for going on 7 years now. And there was definitely, when I came on board, a personnel shift. The core team, Stephen and Scott, have been here since the brand started.
Hmm.
But anytime you have a major shift in the title of winemaker, there's going to be a learning curve.
Sure.
So that's definitely part of it, is just me getting used to working with them getting used to working with me. I've brought different ideas to the table that weren't implemented previously,
Sure.
and there's, learning. There's new things that come out in the journals.
Hmm.
I can tell you that we do work, we do interface with other winemakers, and having conversations with them comes into play as well.
Hmm.
So there is definitely this evolution of our team that's taken place from the time I've come on board till now. The other piece of this is learning from our own programs internally, right? So we make Riesling under the Pacific Rim label. We make a Red Mountain Reserve under the Thick Skin label.
Hmm.
And although these are very different wines, there's an opportunity as a team and as a winemaker to learn from each project. In the case of
Sure.
Thick Skin, we work with a consultant out of California on that project. He brings ideas to the table, and quite frequently, ideas that he brings to the table are applicable to a wine like Silver Raven. So, for instance, press cuts, right? So on Thick Skin, we routinely take a press cut, meaning we'll drain the wine that comes freely off, the free run wine, put the skins in the press, and then take that wine to a separate vessel instead of blending immediately. And
Hmm.
I can tell you with Silver Raven, the initial was, okay, let's just blend it together, right? It's the free run press, it's all one wine. Working with thick skinned, we see, oh, there's an advantage to implementing this extra technique.
Sure.
And so applying that same thinking to Silver Raven, we've now been given ourselves another tool for blending purposes.
Exactly. And I think what you're getting at too is kind of this many years of experience building this expertise, let's say, not only in Cabernet, but with all of your red fruit, right? Understanding a little bit new techniques that you can use that can apply across the board. And I love the sharing of information. It's one of the beauties, I think, within our larger Banffy Wines portfolio is that I've seen the great interchange and exchange of information between whether it be our winemakers over in Oregon, our winemakers in Italy, who I know you're working closely with now on some new trials. And I think all of this great shared information for all of our wineries has just been so beneficial, in addition to the work, of course, that you've been doing for years that you alluded
Oh,
to. So
absolutely.
in the end, I think, and you said this beautifully the other day when we spoke, this wine, Silver Raven, represents 30 years, let's say, of winemaking expertise, of trial and error, of trying new things, and being able to bring that now on this new label is just something that we're super, super excited about. And I think everyone who is watching will get that certainly in the glass, in the bottle. It is there, and we're really excited for everyone to taste it.
Absolutely.
There's something generally to be said here about Washington State and delivering really lovely Cabernet, something that you spoke to early on about what even drew you here. But I think more than that, why would or why should, let's say, Cabernet enthusiasts turn to Silver Raven? What do we have here that's so special, bringing all of these points combined that we just spoke about?
Right. I mean, what are you looking for as a Cabernet drinker? You're looking for a wine that maybe doesn't hit you over the head, but definitely brings some power. Cabernet tends to bring tannin, grip. There's a power to the wine,
Hmm.
and but by the same token, most wine drinkers, although they think they might want to be hit over the head with a wine, they really don't. Right? It doesn't bring enjoyment. It doesn't bring pleasure,
Sure.
and so I think Silver Raven again is this harmonious mixture of the two worlds of bringing the best of what Cabernet has to offer, the power and the structure, but there's an elegance, there's a vibrancy, there's a fresh fruit character. And this gets back to what I was talking about earlier about learning from the two sides of our portfolio. You know, in a lot of sense, being a white winemaker takes more detail. And that detail, when applied to red wine making, leads to some very positive, some very beneficial results.
So I mean, I think to sum it up, obviously, there's something here that both old and new world drinkers, find something to love in this wine, right? To your point, it's that balance. Certainly a food wine for sure, but also really, really enjoyable just on its own. There's really something to love for old and new world drinkers. And that's really the key. And yes, certainly, I think a lot of that is soil, is climate, right? We talked about the Missoula floods, but it's also your approach. And I really love that idea of it's taken years, as it should in any relationship, right? For all of you
Right.
to learn how you work together. And it's not so much about, oh, this is clearly Tim's style of winemaking. It's
Not at
more
all.
you're allowing Horse Heaven Hills to come through. You're allowing the Cabernet and that little bit of Malbec to come through. But of course, you're as a team going to have your own style, and that style I think very much mirrors all of the wines, not only within the Pacific Rim portfolio but within the Banffy Wines portfolio, which is this elegance, this balance, this food friendliness, really bringing out this purity, not overwhelming with anything that you're doing in the winery, right? Everything you're doing in the
Right.
winery is to bring out what is already there, and really highlighting that. And I guess kind of speaking of what you're doing in the winery, I thought maybe if you could tell us, just take this opportunity, this might be our ninth question if I'm counting
Yeah.
correctly, just maybe about some of the green initiatives, some of the focus really on sustainability that we're doing at the winery, and why that's so important to us and our ethos.
Right. So one of the things, and this mostly was actually all of it was in place before I came on board, right? Just to give credit to the team that was here already.
Sure.
Steven Seelock, my boss, has done a great job of implementing these processes. And actually I met him on a committee 10 years ago, 15 years ago, on a committee that was dedicated to developing sustainable practices in Washington State. But one of the things that they've done here is water usage, right?
True.
So typical industry average to make a gallon of wine, it takes 8 gallons of water. And that
Wow.
number is primarily dedicated to cleaning,
Yeah.
right? We are making a food product. It's important to have a clean facility. What they've done here, and some of it's culture, some of it's recycling the water when, so cleaning a tank, for instance, industry practice might be, oh, put this water down the drain when you're done with it. Well, what's happened here is by recycling some of this water, using it for multiple tank washes, you've now cut down the amount of water that you're using. Another instance is, and I've done this at other wineries, where you would fill up a 2 to 300 gallon tub with water, and that's what you're washing the tank with. Here, we're using 20 to 30 gallons to wash that same tank, right? So it's processes
Interesting.
like that that have allowed us to drop our water usage from 8 gallons per gallon of wine down to
Hmm.
1.5 to 2. So really world-class
Incredible.
water usage. Wind power offsets, right? So all of our
Yep.
electricity here at the winery that we use is offset by wind power credits.
Yep.
We use in the Riesling in particular, we're using the lightest weight glass in the industry.
Yeah.
So this means more wine shipped, lower carbon footprint,
Yep.
right? So all
Yep.
of these things go into our company-wide ethos of sustainability.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I think everyone knows that's not an easy undertaking. It's often not an inexpensive undertaking to take on, many of these practices, but I know it speaks really, to the core of what we aim to achieve, right? That purity not only applies to expression of fruit, it applies to kind of how we're treating the environment and our people. And those are the things you can't taste, you can't smell in the wine, but
Right.
are of the utmost importance. So
To your point though, Dino, I mean the best definition I've ever heard of for terroir
yeah,
includes the people and the facility. So,
absolutely.
if you include that into our definition, you can taste that, right? You can taste that ethos in the wine.
For sure. It's that social accountability, right? That kind of
Absolutely.
is overarching to everything. So thank you for that. And I think it's time to smell and taste. I don't know about you. We've been talking about this wine for a while now. Full disclosure, I have poured out in my glass for a little while now since before we started talking. And I am amazed just on getting my nose back in there how much it has evolved over the last few minutes, half an hour that I've had it in the glass. Really beautifully. I mean, right off the jump, right out of the bottle was already stunning, but it has just continued to evolve in the glass. You know what's funny, Tim?
What's
I
that?
feel like I can see the Malbec. I see it.
It's waving its hand. It's like,
It's
I'm here, I'm
waving.
here.
There's that little bit of kind of purpley hue that you expect, that depth of color that you
Right.
you see it. You kind of know it's there, even
I
without
mean, one
smelling
of
and
the
tasting.
things that strikes out or jumps out to me is our use of oak.
Hmm.
And where I'm smelling that is there's almost a nutmeg. I mean, it feels like there's some of that baking spice aroma there.
Hmm.
And behind that is that depth of fruit, the Malbec.
Yeah. And across, I mean, the first thing I got when I tasted it when I first poured it out was kind of this certainly beautiful fruit, kind of floral, almost violet, but almost this what I was in my head thinking a bright jam, which may sound silly. And as it's opened up, it's less of that kind of cooked fruit, more herbaceous now, and it's just getting what's amazing to me at first taste was just how bright and vibrant the wine is, considering how much depth of fruit there is as well. It's
Right.
this integration that's really, really stunning.
And I getting back to what makes Washington great and our vineyard sourcing great is sometimes you hear the word herbaceous and people can think, there could be negative connotations there,
Sure,
right?
sure.
And I don't think we see that at all in Washington State, and in particular with this wine, where it's a savory note,
Absolutely.
but not green, right? It doesn't come across like you're chewing grass. You're like, oh,
Right.
there's a woodsy smell, or like I said, a nutmeg, or so all of these there's spicy floral notes, but not necessarily green notes.
No, absolutely. And you're right. I think it's maybe more of the baking spice idea given the time of year, maybe even some kind of, as I said, violet, but almost a rosemary kind of really beautiful,
Hmm.
savory herb. Not green, but just really flavorful, let's say. Really stunning. And it is actually making me a little bit hungry. I'm salivating. Although great on its own, as I said, but that old world comes through where all of a sudden I'm like, you know what? Now I'm hungry. So
Right.
what are we eating with this? What are you eating with this wine?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is definitely cheeses,
Hmm.
right? But anything fatty, a nice steak, cheese.
hmm
Oh, what else?
I'm thinking of holiday time here where there's always a mix from anything from turkeys to ham to lamb. Of course, in my house it's always lamb. I think something gamey could work really nicely,
Right.
certainly. Anything even roasted or grilled. I mean, even the humble hamburger would be fantastic, right? Because you're getting
Absolutely.
that little bit of spicy, that little bit of herb, a little bit of jam.
Well,
Um,
and even, the salamis, right? The dried meats, the prosciuttos, where you've got that nice
Absolutely.
fatty character, and that mouth-watering characteristic is going to cut right through that fat.
Absolutely. I think this runs the gamut pretty well. It's quite versatile from beginning to end of a meal. Even something
Absolutely.
even something to finish off the meal. Maybe not something that's super, super sweet. But if you kind of have maybe like some kind of dark chocolate of some kind that makes sense with a little bit of bitterness, a little bit of sweetness. Um, I think this could work pretty well.
You're spot on correct.
And I think I have to go back to you. You mentioned kind of the portfolio, and certainly from Pacific Rim, and I think we're very well known, certainly for our Rieslings, which should be considered some of the most versatile, right? The one of the most versatile grapes, certainly in the world. And I think that knowledge, that expertise, and that, of course, range of sweet to dry, right? Where you've got these wines that are made truly for food. That expertise translates here as well, where
Right.
you've got a wine that is a serious wine. It's certainly a bold red wine, um, but it's really, really food friendly and really versatile. And I'm, and I got to tell you, I took my first sip before we started talking, and I feel like it lingered on my palate the entire conversation. I mean, the finish is incredible, incredibly long.
Thank you. There's a diversity to the wine world. And as I said, Washington fits this really nice niche between old world and new world,
hmm
and in
hmm
particular Silver Raven here. So it has a lot of applications across the board. I think to your point, it's going to hit, the Cabernet lovers palate, but it's also maybe going to hit the palate of people who are just starting to learn about red wines. There's a huge versatility to this wine that would appeal to a large population group.
Tim, I can't thank you enough for taking the time. I know you're busy, you're at the winery, but thank you for giving us some really important insight into this beautiful new wine, into Silver Raven, certainly into your background, into the inner workings of the winery. And congratulations, I have to say, on behalf of all of us, because this wine is absolutely stunning. And thank you, because it makes it so much easier for all of us to go out and talk about wines like this that are so, so beautiful. So thank you.
You're welcome. I can't wait to see it in the hands of our sales team and to see it on a store shelf near me. Cheers.
Thank you, Tim. Cheers.